Hello, my name is Tammy Medlin, and I'm the Public History Librarian here at the Wilson County Public Library. And today we're going to answer the question, why women should vote. And it's a one-word answer, the cost. Let's begin by taking a journey back in time. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband John, who was with the Continental Congress, who had just declared independence from Great Britain. She said, and I quote, "And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it would be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." John basically thought it was a joke. This was his reply. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are a little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects." However, he also goes on to talk about the despotism of the petticoat, and that if that happened, he would hope George Washington and all the brave heroes would fight. Well, what were Abigail and John talking about? It was something called coverture, and it was the law in England and had been the law here in the colonies. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity disappeared. It merged with that of her husband, and her husband was the one in control. A married woman could not make a will, could not sign a contract, and could not sue or be sued. Any property she had even before marriage came under the control of her husband. It could even be seized for his debts. Not hers, but his. Unfortunately, this also became the law in the states. Walter Clark, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, summed up coverture this way in 1913. "Upon her marriage, the husband and the wife became one, and that one was the husband. He was the master. The wife was a non-entity." Clark compared the wife's status to that of a slave. The reality of coverture can be seen in wills of the 18th and 19th century. This is the will of Hardy Morgan, and it was dated March 21st, 1811. To his wife, Elizabeth Morgan, all property during her lifetime, after her death to go to all my children except son Henry Morgan, who has already received his part. Son William Morgan, the land after his mother's death or marriage. Note that last phrase, after his mother's death or marriage. Hardy Morgan did not want the land to stay with his wife after she died or even after she remarried. The reason? If Elizabeth Morgan inherited land from Hardy and then remarried, her new husband would control the land. He could rent it, lease it, and might even sell it. Therefore, Hardy Morgan and most other men put the phrase during her lifetime in their wills to make sure their property went to their children and not their wife's new husband. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the United States, was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They had met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. However, even though Lucretia was a delegate, she wasn't permitted to speak. None of the female delegates were. It was decided it was unbecoming for women to speak in public. Out of the Seneca Falls Convention came what is called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was a list of abuses women had suffered under the law as it currently was, and a list of resolutions they wanted. The right to vote was listed as a grievance and a resolution. Grievance, they didn't have it. Resolution, they were determined to get it. Susan B. Anthony met Stanton in 1851, and they made a powerful team. In 1869, they formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, which became the National American Woman Suffrage Association by merging with another organization in 1890. Stanton wrote and Anthony made speeches and gave lectures. Anthony brought attention to the cause when she was arrested in New York in 1872 for voting in the presidential election. She was found guilty and fined $100. She never paid it. By the 1840, coverture, which had been the tradition, began to fall out of favor in a lot of states, including New York. The states began to pass what were called married women's property laws. Basically, the husband kept control of the property, but he couldn't sell it and it couldn't be seized for his debts. The woman retained ownership. North Carolina did not pass a married woman's property law until 1868 after the Civil War had ended, and this is what it said. Article 10, Section 6 of the North Carolina Constitution. The real and personal property of any female in this state, acquired before marriage, and all property, real and personal, to which she may, after marriage, become in any manner entitled, shall be and remain the sole and separate estate and property of such female, and shall not be liable for any debts, obligations, or engagements of her husband, and may be devised or bequeathed, and, with the written assent of her husband, conveyed by her as if she were unmarried. Real property means land and anything attached to it that cannot be moved, like a house, buildings, crops. Personal property means things like jewelry, clothing, and furniture. What it means is a woman could leave her property to whom she chose, but while she lived, she couldn't really benefit from it monetarily without her husband's permission. To convey something involves a deed, so a woman could not sell, rent, or lease her land unless her husband gave written permission. Frances Willard became president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879. It was the largest temperance organization in the United States, and Willard added women's suffrage to the group's platform. She became a valuable ally for Stanton and Anthony. However, this had the effect of making enemies of anyone who made their living from alcohol. Basically, anyone who owned a distillery, brewery, or saloon. This print from 1909 shows how suffragists were often portrayed in the local media. Election day. The man is shown sitting in a chair, wearing an apron, holding two crying, screaming children, while the woman proudly goes off to vote. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a ballot that's marked the Hens Party. For President, Mrs. Henry Peck. For Vice President, Miss Willem Nagg. Basically, anyone whose wife voted would be henpecked, and any woman who voted would be seen as a nag. Suffragists developed their own unique ways of getting their message across, and one way was suffragist parades. In 1913, the National American Woman Suffrage Association held a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is Inez Mulholland Volzabane getting ready to ride down Pennsylvania Avenue. This parade was held the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration to maximize publicity. If you've ever wondered why a lot of suffragists wore white when they were on parade, they wanted to stand out. They wanted to be seen. This map, the victory map of 1917, shows how much things had changed and how far there was left to go. In the states in white, women had full suffrage, and in some places they gained it fairly early. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869 and Colorado in 1893. Some states allowed women limited suffrage. In some states they could vote for the president. In others they could only vote in primary elections. And in some they could only vote in local elections, such as those involving school boards. But in the states in black, women had no right to vote in any election, and a lot of those states were located in the South. Not all suffragist leaders agreed on the same methods, and this led to dissension in the ranks. Carrie Chapman Catt was president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association from 1900 to 1904, and again from 1915 to 1920. Their tactics included parades, conventions, but they mostly relied on lobbying and presenting petitions to politicians. She developed what became known as the winning plan that had two stages. The association would campaign for suffrage state by state until 36 had granted women the right to vote. Those 36 would then vote to ratify a constitutional amendment. The North Carolina Equal Suffrage League was organized in 1913, and it favored the tactics of the National American Woman Suffrage Association and Carrie Chapman Catt. The League was on record as saying they were opposed to any form of militancy and wanted to gain the vote by an appeal to reason and fair play. Gertrude Ville, seen on the left, was state president. This photo shows the inside of League headquarters. There was a chapter of the Equal Suffrage League in Wilson. The following announcement appeared in the Wilson Times on March 17, 1919. The Wilson Equal Suffrage League. The Wilson Equal Suffrage League will meet in the YMCA rooms Tuesday afternoon, March 18th at 4:30. This organization has only recently been formed, but it is hoped that its influence may be felt in no uncertain way during the coming months. The membership is growing, but we need the support of every intelligent woman of Wilson County. Alice Paul was a member of the National American Woman Suffrage Association and helped organize the 1913 parade in Washington, D.C., but soon after she came into conflict with Carrie Chapman Catt and other leaders. Paul wanted to campaign on a national level and push for a constitutional amendment, not state by state. She was also more militant. She left to form the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which later became the National Woman's Party. The Silent Sentinels. From January 10, 1917 until June 4, 1919, the National Woman's Party picketed the White House 6 days a week in all types of weather. They were the first group to use this tactic. They did not stop until Congress passed the suffrage amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I. The NAWSA toned down its campaigning and focused on supporting the war effort. Catt emphasized women's role in the war to raise support for suffrage among politicians and the general public. In order to support the war, women began to take on roles usually reserved for men. This photo shows women working on the Great Northern Railway at Great Falls, Montana in 1918. This photo shows women welders working at Hog Island Shipyard. These were the first women in the U.S. to be engaged in the actual construction of ships. This photo shows yeomen attached to the Naval Reserve in San Francisco. In order to put more men on the ships, the Navy used women as radio and telephone operators, as well as translators, mechanics, and truck drivers. Alice Paul and her silent sentinels never backed down from controversy. This banner comparing President Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was provocative, and they knew it. It went on display on August 17, 1917. A crowd soon ripped it to pieces. Several protesters were charged with trespassing and arrested. They never paid the fine. As the standoff continued, the penalties for the women arrested increased. Alice Paul herself was sentenced to several months. She and others stated that they were political prisoners. They actually went on hunger strike, and some were force-fed. When word got out, the women were released. They later went on a prison tour to talk about their ordeal. After World War I, President Wilson became a supporter of women's suffrage. He told Carrie Chapman Catt it was because of women's contributions to the war effort. The struggle had entered the home stretch. This slide shows a timeline of women's rights in North Carolina. In 1776, North Carolina based its laws on coverture. In 1868, protections for married women's property was written into the new state constitution. In 1897, a bill for women's suffrage was referred to the Committee on Insane Asylums. In 1913, the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League was formed. 1917, U.S. enters World War I, which ends a year later. 1918 also saw the beginning of a worldwide influenza epidemic. In 1919, Congress sent the 19th Amendment to the states for ratification. In August 1920, North Carolina voted on the suffrage amendment. By July 2, 1920, 35 states had ratified the suffrage amendment, and only one more was needed. Unfortunately, 8 states had outright rejected the amendment, and these states included Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, as well as Mississippi. As you can see, most of these states were in the South. There were only 5 states who would be able to give the final vote. They included North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, Connecticut, and Vermont. North Carolina and Tennessee both scheduled special legislative sessions in August 1920 to consider the suffrage amendment. The North Carolina legislature went into session to consider the 19th Amendment on August 10, 1920. Governor Thomas Bickett was against suffrage, but he felt it was going to happen, so North Carolina should, and I quote, accept the unavoidable and ratify the amendment. He made these comments when he introduced the legislation on August 13th. And by the way, his wife was in the room when he said that. The 19th Amendment was not going to have an easy time in North Carolina. On August 11th, members of the North Carolina House of Representatives sent the following telegram to the Tennessee legislature. Quote, we, the undersigned members of the House of Representatives of the General Assembly of North Carolina, constituting a majority of said body, send greetings to the General Assembly of Tennessee and assure you that we will not ratify the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, interfering with the sovereignty of Tennessee and other states of the Union. We most respectfully request that this measure be not forced upon the people of North Carolina. End quote. In other words, we're not going to vote for it, and we would like it if you wouldn't either. When the North Carolina Senate met to discuss the amendment on April 17th, Senator Lindsey C. Warren proposed that rather than vote on the ratification itself, the issue should be postponed until the regular session in 1921. This idea passed, and the bill never made it to the North Carolina House. North Carolina did not vote yes or no. They simply passed the buck to Tennessee. The Tennessee legislature was meeting at the same time as North Carolina to consider suffrage. The measure quickly passed in Tennessee Senate, but stalled in the House, where there was a motion to table it. That motion wound up in a tie, 48-48. The House then decided to vote on the amendment itself, and it passed 50-46. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. One story about how this happened is legislator Harry Byrne, who was going to vote against suffrage, received a message from his mother Phoebe, who told him to vote for suffrage and help Miss Cat put the rat in ratification. Gertrude Ville, who had led the fight in North Carolina as head of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League, summed up the situation this way on August 23, 1920. My dear fellow suffragists, as you know, our fight for ratification by the North Carolina legislature is over. We were unsuccessful in our efforts. Our North Carolina men have refused to ratify. We received the gift of political equality at the hands of men of other states. That gift is something women should not take for granted. The cost has been too high and the struggle was too long. That is why women should vote. Note, any photographs used in this program, unless otherwise noted, can be found at the Library of Congress or the National Archives.